country. We're able to make sure that 9 million Canadians, 3 million seniors will have access to dental care. They're voting against that. They're against that. Are they against pharmacare? Are they against the other fruits of cooperation that come from... Colleagues. Again, colleagues, it is very important for us, for those of us who have the ability to speak both languages, it's a clear advantage of being in the House that we don't require the use of the headsets. But for those of us who do require it, it's very difficult for them to hear the questions or the answers if there's too much noise in the House. I ask all members, out of respect to all of their colleagues in each of your respective caucuses, is to please listen respectfully to the answers and to the questions, so that those of us who require the use of earphones can do so. The honourable member from Nanaimo, Ladysmith.
Mr. Speaker, the number of people unable to find an affordable place to live in Nanaimo Ladysmith is staggering. And what have the Liberals done? Cut the Reaching Home funding to Nanaimo by 60%. And the Conservatives plan gut funding and leave it up to rich developers who just so happen to be their biggest donors. Nanaimo needs more support, not less. The Mayor of Nanaimo is calling for federal support. Will the minister provide the funding required for truly affordable housing in Nanaimo?
Hear, 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 hear. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to take up the specific matter with the member who just raised it after question period to know more about that specific case in Nanaimo. But what I will say is that this federal government is absolutely committed to ensuring there's greater supply. Supply is always what underpins a housing crisis in this country and every other country that's experiencing exactly that. We need to see more building, and that's why we've incented the private sector by lifting GST on the building of apartment rentals. We've moved forward to work with municipalities to see zoning changes where so much of this is dealt with in terms of affordability. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from Edmonton Strathcona.
Mr. Speaker, New Democrats are delivering diabetes medicine and devices and contraceptives for all Canadians today. Yeah. Free contraceptives are life-changing for women across this country. But shamefully, Danielle Smith said she doesn't want that for Albertans. Right. My constituents are outraged, and the Conservative leader, when he was asked by the media about this, literally ran away. So he didn't have to talk about fairness for women. Will this government ensure that they sign agreements with all provinces so all women, all Canadians have access to
the Honourable Minister of Health.
Access to medication for diabetes is not just a question of social justice. It's a question of saving lives. It's a question of prevention. It's a question of reducing costs enormously across this country. And I can say, and specifically with Alberta, that I've had very constructive conversations with Adriana Lagrange, who's been willing to work and find compromise, find that common ground. Unfortunately, across the aisle, that's not what we see. Today, the leader of the official opposition, the Conservatives, ran away when asked if he would support diabetes medication, refused to answer whether or not he would slash contraceptives for women. They are already against dental. I'd really like to know where they stand for pharmacare.
The honourable member from Pontiac.
The honourable member for Pontiac. Mr. Speaker, journalists and newsrooms are one of the pillars of our democracy in Canada, and in rural communities like ours, they play a role that's even more fundamental. In December, the Minister of Heritage reached an historic agreement with Google to provide $100 million of funding to newsrooms. Can she give this House an update on how and when newsrooms, but especially local media, will have access to this funding? Thank you. The Honourable Minister of Heritage. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And despite months of opposition from the Conservatives last year, we adopted the Online News Act, which allowed us to reach an historic agreement with Google. That's $100 million in funding that Google's going to invest in local media that would never have been available had the Conservatives been in power. And yesterday, Google launched its open bid office to ask for eligible newsrooms to apply. Canadians can be sure that on this side of the House, we are always going to stand up to ensure that technological giants pay their fair share to protect Canadian citizens. Thank you. I would just like to ask the member for Portneuf, Jacques Cartier, to respect people taking the floor. The honourable member for Regina Capel.
Confused because it's not Conservatives making a link between these scientists and threats to national security. It's the government's own security agencies themselves saying that these individuals, quote, were collaborating with foreign entities that present a threat to the security of Canada. We're talking about research with pathogens and deadly viruses, while at the same time these individuals were on the payroll of the People's Liberation Army for the communist regime in Beijing. Now, rather than inform Canadians and come clean at the outset, the government went into overdrive to cover it up. How could the Prime Minister be so callous and selfish that he would try to protect himself rather than the security of Canadians?
The Honourable Minister for Innovation.
I'm very happy to answer to my colleague because Canada has shown leadership when it comes to national security, Mr. Speaker. That's something the Conservative will not want to highlight to Canadians. But let me refresh their memory because they tend to be selective when it comes to the facts. On the 16th of January, Mr. Speaker, we announced that we will ban funding for research in sensitive areas. There's 100 entities around the world, Mr. Speaker. We work with our Five Eyes allies. We work with research centers in this country. We work with university. Mr. Speaker, Canadians know that we will always put national security first and defend the interest of Canada.
The honourable member from Regina Capel.
They want to give themselves a gold star that finally 3 years later, after fighting, kicking and screaming to keep these documents hidden, that now they've been released only because Conservatives demanded it. Let's remember the facts. They ignored and refused to comply with 4 parliamentary orders. They took the unprecedented step of taking the Speaker of the House of Commons to court to keep these documents hidden, and then they called a snap election hoping it would all go away. If this was all just an administrative issue, then why the cover-up?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
In the first order, one of the things that is disturbing about what the member is supposing is that if he was in government, and I hope that that doesn't happen, that they would interfere in the redaction process and they would be involved in it. We obviously did not do that, particularly not with national security. What we did do, and in fact, the member opposite and I had a conversation about this. First, I suggested immediately that they see the documents at NSI Cop. He said that wasn't good enough. So I created an ad hoc committee. The ad hoc committee gave them the opportunity not only to see the documents, but put to an independent arbiter whether or not they should be released publicly. We did that together. The documents are released. They're now before us.
The honourable member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is recognized for his admiration for China's basic dictatorship. After 8 years, he let the Chinese Communist Party interfere in our elections. He turned a blind eye to the interference with the Chinese diaspora. And with this Winnipeg lab matter, we see that there are people who represent a credible and serious danger to compromise Canada's national security. Will the Prime Minister finally admit that he tried to cover up these documents to protect himself instead of protecting Canadians? The Honourable Minister of Innovation. Mr. Speaker, people listening at home must be saying, well, where were the Conservatives on January 16th? They must wonder, because on January 16th, Mr. Speaker, we announced as a government that we were going to ban funding. May I urge members, please, who have not been recognized, to wait their turn, and that way we'll be able to have a proper discussion instead of shouting across the aisle. The Honourable Minister, please continue. 22 seconds remaining. Mr. Speaker, I hope that the Conservatives will listen this time, because on January 16th, Mr. Speaker, we banned research in sensitive areas to work with 100 different companies. We are working with our allies to protect science, to protect intellectual property, and to protect the work that is done by our universities, Mr. Speaker. We are always there to defend Canada's interests. The Honourable Member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Where was the minister, Mr. Speaker, in July 2019 when 2 scientists were expelled from Canada, Mr. Speaker, by CSIS? That was in 2019. That was more than 4 years ago, Mr. Speaker. What we learned yesterday is that the Prime Minister ignored 4 parliamentary orders to produce papers. He took the Speaker to court, which has never been seen before, for the worst cover-up in history. Why did the Prime Minister choose to protect himself instead of Canada's national security? The Honourable Minister of Innovation. Mr. Speaker, people listening at home must be shocked. We have just told Conservatives once again that not only the Prime Minister but all members of the government on this side of the House, we take national security seriously. On January 16th, we did not ban one research entity, but 100. So we are protecting universities and colleges from this type of thing. So that's the type of measure we're putting in place to protect Canada's interests. We always stand up for science. The Honourable Member for Montcalm. When it comes to health care, Quebecers want care, not threats. A year after having forced Quebec to accept an increase in health transfers that covers only 1/6 of their needs, the federal government is now threatening Quebec that it will steal $900 million if we don't submit our conditions by March 31st. The Liberals are once again playing political games at the expense of Quebecers with our own money. When will the Liberals finally stop taking ill people hostage and pay Quebec the the money that it's entitled to? The Honourable Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, I understand that the Bloc Québécois just likes to squabble. But when I spoke with Minister Lebel, it is clear that her objective is to cooperate and to find solutions. In our healthcare system, I think that Canadians and Quebecers want politicians, members, to find solutions, not to pick fights. And that is why I am very sure that we are going to find an agreement with Quebec. The Honourable Member for Montcalm. Mr. Speaker, pharmacare is not coming anytime soon. Bill C-64 refers to principles to consider when working towards the implementation of national universal pharmacare. Otherwise, in fact, that actually sounds like an election promise to me. The NDP is sold out very cheaply. But if one day, after having discussed these principles to consider when working towards the implementation of pharmacare, if Ottawa comes up with a pharmacare plan that Quebec has already, will Quebec be able to withdraw with full compensation, no strings attached? The Honourable Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, on the contrary, this year, for the first time in the history of the country, everyone with diabetes, everyone who needs contraceptives will be able to have access to them. That is such an historical announcement that it will change the lives of so many Canadians, even if Quebec already has such a program. Yesterday, I had a good conversation with Minister Dubé on this topic, and I think that we will reach an agreement with Quebec very soon.
Alderman Norfolk.
Common sense Conservatives will axe the tax, build the homes, fix the budget, and stop the crime. After 8 years, this Liberal NDP Prime Minister is not worth the cost, the crime, or the corruption. Never before in the history of this great nation have so many people have to resort to food banks. Thousands are now resorting to dumpster diving because they can no longer afford the cost of